Welcome to English Grammar, the Clause, Part 2. In this class, we're going to continue our discussion about subordinate clauses. We're going to discuss sentences classified by structure and sentences classified by purpose. In the previous class, we discussed the adjective clause, the relative pronouns, and the noun clause. Remembering that there are the following two functions for a subordinate clause: the adverb clause and the subordinating conjunction. Let's talk about the adverb clause. An adverb clause is a subordinate clause that, like an adverb, modifies a verb, an adjective, or an adverb. This is probably one of the most versatile clauses, which is a group of words, not a complete sentence, but it is a group of words, either independent or subordinate. Now, remembering what we talked about yesterday, independent clauses, they're loners. They can be pulled out and they can be set aside, and they in themselves, an independent clause, will make sense to the reader. It has a complete thought involved. A subordinating clause, they're really needy. They are that needy friend. They absolutely need an independent clause to help them to make sense. An adverb clause is a subordinate clause, so it's a needy clause that, like an adverb, modifies the verb, an adjective, and an adverb. So remembering what that part of speech, the adverb, real quick. Let's talk about the adverb. The reason we studied so hard on all these different parts of speech is so that when we use these terms in these lessons, you would then be able to go, oh, that's right, an adverb. So an adverb is simply a part of speech that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. So it's a very versatile part of speech. And this particular clause, an adverb clause, is just like an adverb. It has the ability to modify the verb, the adjective, or an adverb. Now, remembering real quick, the adjective here, it only modifies nouns and pronouns. It's very limited. However, an adverb, which is the verbal counterpart, can modify it can modify other adverbs, it can modify the verb, and it can also modify or assist and strengthen an adjective. The typical adverbial function of an adverb clause tell how much, when, where, why, or to what extent, or under what conditions. So let's look at a couple of real quick examples. She practices as though her life depended on it. Let's look at this. So, real quick, if we're going to sentence diagram, she is your subject, okay? This whole sentence, everything here, is talking about the subject. We can draw a line right there and look. Practices as though her life depended on it is a predicate. Remember those words. We gotta keep up to date with those. You gotta keep those in your head. Those aren't just things that we were using in previous lessons that you can now catalog in your brain and just forget about or wipe the slate clean. No, you need to stay up to date with your terminology. It's so important when we're talking about grammar, when we're talking about the usage of this particular language, and really any language. They all have subjects and they all have predicates, and they're so important. But real quick, so she is the subject. Okay, so this whole sentence, the predicate, everything is talking about it. But here, let's look at the adverbial phrase that is given here, right here. So, as though her life depended on it. Well, this part, this particular thing in brackets, is talking about how she practices. It's so important that you see that she practices, okay? Well, she is the noun or the pronoun. It's the word that has replaced her name. If her name were Jennifer, Jennifer practices as though her life depended on it, and that would be a proper noun. But here we have a pronoun, which is fine, but practices is the verb. It's the verb. And as though her life depended on it is supporting and telling something about this verb practices. Okay, so how? It's telling us how she practices. She practices as though her life depends on it. So it's so important to her that she practices in a method that shows how she practices. But let's look at a second sentence. So again, we have our subject, she, the pronoun, and practices is still the verb. But now we have this little adverbial phrase, whenever she has time. So she practices whenever she has time. Well, obviously this word, whenever, is telling us about when. It's triggering. It's one of those triggers. You need to start reading and start analyzing words. Words are not just thrown on a page. We've already talked about this. They're specific. They're orchestrated through the mind of the writer, and they convey a message. And so now we're conveying adverbial clauses. Whenever she has time is talking about when. When does she practice? Whenever she has time. And finally, the third example given here, she practices. Again, she is the subject. Practices is the verb right here. Whenever, wherever the team travels. So apparently this girl, she, is on a team. So in this particular adverbial phrase, clause, wherever the team travels, does not necessarily make any sense. So if you were to scratch this out, or scratch this out, or scratch this out, it's unsupported. It's unsupported because as though her life depended on it, while that says a whole lot, it doesn't make sense to just blurt it out. We all have those random friends that just blurt out things. I have a 5-year-old, and sometimes he just blurts out things that just go, huh? What on earth are you talking about? And I think in some cases, there are these wonderful adverbial clauses that he was thinking about and he just blurted it out, but it has no meaning. It's saying something, but it's not a complete thought. It's a subordinate clause. So as though her life depended on it, wherever she has time, or whenever she has time, wherever the team travels, those things don't tell us everything, but they give us specifics. But in this particular case, she practices wherever the team travels, tells us where she practices. So you can see adverbial phrases do a whole lot, and they strengthen the sentence, but they do not stand alone. They are so needy. Let's look at a couple more. She practices, again, we're sticking with the she practices. She being the pronoun, practices being the verb, because she wants to win. Well, I think everybody in athletics wants to win. Soccer is such I'm sorry, my apologies to my international friends. Football is so important around the world, whether it be Brazil or Ethiopia or any of these places. People practice, these teams practice because they want to win. And apparently she practices because she wants to win. So it talks about why. Why is she practicing? Well, she practices because she wants to win. The whole objective of her practice, all of this in this adverbial phrase, is to talk about why she practices. She practices more than anyone else does. Wow. Well, more than anyone else does tells us how much. How much? How much does she practice? More than anyone else does. That's a big deal. Those are big details. She practices on weekends if her schedule permits. Wow. So you see, even here, now we've been given some more details. We've been given some details of an independent clause that's attached to an adverbial subordinate clause. Okay? She practices on weekends, period. I mean, if we were to look at that, you could just put a period right there and scratch that out. Just put a period right there at the end of that sentence and scratch the rest of it out. Because she practices on weekends actually gives us a complete thought. You know exactly when she's practicing. But if you want to know under what circumstances she practices or under what conditions she practices, then you need the adverbial clause here, if her schedule permits. It's really pretty simple. She practices on weekends. Still, everything is mindful on this. She practices. You have to refer this whole sentence, everything. She practices on weekends. That's talking about when. That's talking about why. That's talking about how. It's talking about everything. This whole sentence is back to she's practicing. It all comes back to she practices. But if you want full details on why she practices or on how much she practices or under what circumstances she practices, then you have to add an adverbial clause or you have to look for it. And if her schedule permits is giving us a set parameter of the conditions under which she practices on the weekends. An adverb clause or adverb clauses may also modify adjectives and other adverbs. Like I said, this is a very versatile clause. It is a very versatile part of English grammar because an adverb, just like an adverb as a part of speech, does a whole lot of different jobs. It does all kinds of things. It helps the verb, it helps the adjectives, it helps other adverbs. It strengthens the sentence. It would be a pretty boring sentence to write without the use of an adverb. And in the same way, when you begin writing sentences, full, complete thoughts, and you start crafting those beautiful, eloquent English sentences, you're going to use a lot of adverb clauses because adverb clauses modify and add richness to the language. They modify the adjectives and other adverbs as well as other verbs. They are very, very important. She is certain that she will make the team. Okay, well, let's look. First of all, she, again, is the pronoun. This is your subject. And everything else following it. Just slice it right there. Everything else is certain that she will make the team is your predicate. I'm just going to abbreviate, folks. Stay with me. All right, so you have a subject and you have a predicate, and so you see how immediately I saw it. And it's because what was I doing? I was looking for the subject, and then everything that follows becomes the predicate. It talks about, a predicate only talks about the subject. Always, 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 always. In a sentence or in a clause, it's always talking about the subject. But real quick, so that she will make the team is your adverbial clause. Why? Because it is modifying this word, certain. Everything about this clause is talking about certain, which, by the way, certain is talking about she. She is certain. So everything folds back. It all goes back to your subject. Adverb clauses often begin with a word like after or because that expresses the relationship between the clause and the rest of the sentence. See, words aren't just really thrown together. Like we've been talking about since day one, words have meaning, they have power, they have influence, and they convey messages. They convey meaning from the speaker or the reader, or from the writer to the reader or the listener. It is so important that we get a good grasp of this. Adverb clauses, they begin with words like after or because, and these words express a relationship. Talking about relationships here between the clause and the rest of the sentence. Okay? So a clause is a group of words that is inside of a complete thought, a complete sentence. A conjunction that begins an adverb clause is called a subordinating conjunction. So let's think about what a conjunction is. A conjunction is and. I'll just give you a couple. And, but, and or. Those three are just the basics. There are more, but those three are the most common of conjunctions. Now, when they begin a subordinating clause, they are then called a subordinating conjunction. It joins the clause to the rest of the sentence. So, here are some common subordinating conjunctions. Let me just read a few. I'm not going to read them all. I fully expect you guys can read for yourself. But after, as if, as long as, because, if, in order that, since, so that, then, than, unless, until, whenever, wherever, whether, and while. Those are just some examples of some common subordinating conjunctions. They connect sentences. They connect the adverbial clause to the rest of the sentence. So, this is a funny little title, the elliptical clause, which is really just an incomplete clause. Okay? You don't have to worry about knowing each and every one of these names. I just want you to know it for your own purposes of learning what they are. You don't have to keep up with them, but it does help you to see that I'm not just making these things up. These are real parts of speech and real parts of the clause. Okay, so this is really part of grammar. Sometimes we do not complete an adverb clause. Okay, an elliptical, well, let's talk about an elliptical. Elliptical is the absence of something. And we'll talk about that in just a second with some examples. Let me show you an example of one. I am much taller than you. Is that correct? I mean, you don't have to have are. I am much taller than you. You could just go period right there. And so, I am much taller than you is complete. But technically, using an elliptical clause, we took out the word are. You could simply say, I am much taller than you are, which is absolutely correct. But using the elliptical or the incomplete clause, we take out this word are. And so I am much taller than you. Let's look at the second example here. While I was running for the bus, I dropped my books. That's correct. But listen, you can take that out. You don't need that. While running for the bus, I dropped my books. Who dropped my books? I did. Because there it is. So while running for the bus, I dropped my books. All I had to do was take out I was. Well, it still makes sense. It's just leaving out some words. In these adverbial clauses, the part of the clause given in the brackets had been omitted. The missing part, however, could be readily provided by a reader or listener. So you already knew that they were supposed to be there, and you already knew what they were talking about. So such incomplete clauses are said to be elliptical. Let's talk about sentences classified by structure. Classified according to their structure, there are four kinds of sentences: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Really, really simple, okay? You should know that there are four kinds of sentences. Everything else is really simple. You may not always remember the names of these, the simple, compound, complex, compound, complex, but you use them all the time. You probably do in your own heart language, or if you're already accustomed to using the English language, you do this without even thinking about it. Or if English is common tongue for you, you already do these things. You probably just didn't know that there were four names: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Let's look at one. A simple sentence, this is the most basic, is a sentence with one independent clause and no subordinate clauses. Okay? So, like I said, when you take that independent clause out and you set it all by itself, because it's a loner, it does its own thing. It doesn't need anybody else. It just pretty much says what it wants to say, and it doesn't need any help. It's independent. It really is a loner. When you set it by itself, that technically is a simple sentence because it's a complete thought. It needs no further explanation, and nothing else needs to be added to an independent clause for it to make sense to a reader or a listener. It is a complete independent clause, and so it is also a simple sentence. Let's look at a simple sentence. Great literature stirs the imagination. That says everything. We know we're talking about great literature, and it stirs the imagination is actually, this whole thing is an independent clause, but stirs the imagination just tells us everything that we need to know about literature. It talks about great literature. A compound sentence, this is the second type of sentence, is a sentence composed of two or more independent clauses, but no subordinate clauses. Okay, so now we are fitting two independent clauses together. Though they stand alone, though they are loners, they need no support from other people, but they can then be joined together to make one sentence, and it's called a compound sentence. So it's two or more independent clauses, and they are put together, and they don't need any subordinate clauses. So they both are saying something. They could both be broken apart and say exactly what they're saying all by themselves, but in this particular case, the compound sentence is made of two or more independent clauses put together. Let's look at an example. Using the original sentence, great literature stirs the imagination. Great. It stands by itself. That is one independent clause. You could put a period there and be done. And look at that, a conjunction, and it challenges the intellect. Well, you could make this sentence stand all by itself. It challenges the intellect. Well, actually, that's a complete thought. It is a complete thought. Great literature stirs the imagination is one independent thought. It challenges the intellect is a complete independent clause in itself. But you put those two together using that beautiful little conjunction there, and now you have a simple sentence with a compound predicate. So let's look at this. Yes, there's all kinds of fun things. So stirs is a predicate and challenges is a predicate. Why? Because these are showing movement to literature, great literature, and challenges. Challenges, all coming back to great literature. But let's look one more time. Great literature stirs the imagination and it challenges the intellect. It's also compound sentence with two subjects and two verbs. These verbs are both talking about great literature. And we also know that stirs the imagination and it challenges the intellect are two subjects and two verbs. They're a compound sentence. A complex sentence, this is the third type of sentence, is a sentence that contains one independent clause and at least one subordinate clause. Okay, so now you have the loner and you have the needy subordinate clause. So you have the Lone Ranger independent clause, and you have the needy subordinate clause, and they are being brought together. And when they are, you have this complex sentence. Why is it complex? Because Mr. Needy subordinate needs that complex, that independent clause in order to fulfill it, to complete it, to make it work. So it becomes a more complex sentence. There's more detail, more things. Looking at it again, here's an example. Great literature, which stirs the imagination, also challenges the intellect. Well, also challenges the intellect now has become a subordinate clause, which is being attached to this great independent clause. All because we change the word to also from it. It challenges the intellect. Well, if that word had been it, that would have been a pronoun. So then it would be two independent clauses. But now that you've taken the word it out and you've taken and it out and now change it to also challenges the intellect, now we have two. We have an independent clause and we have a subordinating clause. And the final sentence is a compound complex sentence, which is a sentence that contains two or more independent clauses and at least one subordinating clause. So think about this real quick. So you have clauses which are simply a group of words that fit into sentences that can be used to make sentences, but they give detail. Each thing gives detail. Subordinating clauses are weak, they're needy, and they need independent clauses. Independent clauses. They need independent clauses. They need to work with an independent clause. But an independent clause, one or two, with a subordinate clause, then becomes a compound complex sentence. Because, look at this, we're building, what is a compound sentence? A compound sentence is two independent clauses coming together to make one sentence. A complex sentence is one or more independent clauses being combined with a subordinate clause. So now you have a combination of the two, a compound complex sentence. Let's look at a quick example. Great literature, which challenges the intellect. Look at that. We just shifted things around. Which challenges the intellect, is sometimes difficult, but it is also rewarding. So we're all talking about great literature. The independent clauses are great literature is sometimes difficult, and it is also rewarding. So these two things, you have this subordinate clause right in the middle. which challenges the intellect doesn't say anything on its own. But when it is combined with this sentence, this little phrase right here, when it's combined with the whole, with the other two independent clauses, it is then strengthened and given a completeness. And it also tells a little bit more. So striking that out, you would have two independent clauses. Great literature is sometimes difficult. That could be period, boom, right there. It is also rewarding. Is also, just take that conjunction out. It is also rewarding is also an independent clause. So there are your two independent clauses, but when you set the subordinate clause in the middle, you see how that works. Great literature, which challenges the intellect, is sometimes difficult, but it is also rewarding. The independent clauses, the subordinate clause, which challenges the intellect. Now let's talk about sentences classified by purpose. These sentences, some sentences are classified according to their purpose. There are 4 kinds of sentences: declarative, imperative, interrogative, and exclamatory. Now, you're probably going, what on earth is he talking about? Well, these 4 sentences, again, like all the other sentences that you are writing, and in your daily writing in your own heart language, you'll probably have terms for all the different kinds of sentences that you use when you're writing down your thoughts. Declarative sentences are the most popular, are the most common. Imperatives are a different kind: interrogative and exclamatory. We use all 4 of these types of sentences, these kinds of sentences, but it's important to recognize their names, what they're called. So when we are talking about grammar, those are the proper names for them. Let's talk about the declarative. A declarative sentence is a sentence that makes a statement. It's simple. We use this all the time. Bo is a great teacher. It's a declarative sentence right there. Bo is an English teacher. Another declarative sentence. We do this constantly. Homes should be made safer for the elderly. It doesn't get any more simple than that. It is a statement. It is a sentence. It's declaring that homes, and then there's your subject, there's your predicate. Should be made safer for the elderly. It's telling us something. It's giving us a statement. An imperative sentence is a sentence that gives a command or makes a request. Now, we probably haven't ever thought about this, but when your mother or your father tell you to take out the trash, you need to take out the trash. Well, that is an imperative sentence. It is giving you a command. If you were to write it down, it would be considered an imperative command. It would be considered an imperative sentence. Jesus gives imperative commands. When Jesus is giving an imperative sentence in Scripture, think of Matthew 28, the Great Commission, when Jesus says, "Go therefore into all the world and make disciples, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you, and baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." When he is saying that, he is actually using an imperative sentence. It is giving you a command. It is a commission. Let's look at a few examples. Close that book and pay attention. Or please lower the volume. You see, those are statements, those are sentences that are giving a command or making a request. The third kind of sentence is an interrogative sentence, which is a sentence that asks a question. Who are you? What is the name of that song? We use interrogative sentences all the time. What is your name? How old are you? These are all examples of interrogative sentences. And you will notice, let me back up just a second, and you will notice that when you ask a question in English grammar, especially with an interrogative statement, we use this question mark. This mark lets the reader know that you are actually asking a question. And in the next sentence, if you were writing about what is the name of that song, then you would say that song, and then you would begin answering. That song is ... Oh, ellipticals, right there. And you would fill in the blank or whatever you want to do. That song is blank. See, when you're writing, it's so easy. You find a question and then you answer it. That's the beauty of even formal research. You find a question that you want to know the answer to, and then you research that and you give an answer. Well, what was the name of that song? Question mark is an interrogative statement, and then you would follow it with a declarative sentence. That song is Amazing Grace, period, which would be an interrogative statement, which would be a declarative statement answering the interrogative sentence. And the final sentence classified by purpose is an exclamatory. Exclamatory sentence is a sentence that expresses strong feeling. Like right about now, you are probably feeling pretty good knowing that this lesson, this class, is almost over. And so you might actually say or write, how happy I am. Well, again, like an interrogative statement, it uses a specific kind of punctuation, the exclamation point, this mark. And when we are texting, people use exclamatory statements. I love you, or I heart you, when we're texting, and they do the little exclamation points. Well, those are all examples of an exclamatory statement. It is expressing feeling, it is expressing an emotion, and it's putting it in words. And so we use exclamatory statements and sentences all the time, especially when we're texting on our telephones, on our cell phones. How happy I am. Well, that's an exclamation point. We use the language that we are given. In the next class, we're going to begin talking about agreement of subject and verb. Thank you, God bless, and have a blessed day.